Good afternoon, and my name is Igor Blažević, and welcome to the next episode of the Reinventing Civil Society. I have a real honor and pleasure to have with me today as a guest Scot Nakagawa from the United States. So, Scott, welcome, hello.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I I discovered Scott relatively recently when I got from somebody one essay from his Anti-Authoritarian Playbook, what he's publishing on Substack. And I have really been attracted by that. There are so much very, very useful, interesting reflections about authoritarianism and about democratic struggle against the authoritarianism. So, for example, recently there has been two excellent pieces. What if we win, and what if we lose? I will focus our discussion today on another article of the Scott, How Democracy Wins. And then I started to try to learn a little bit more who the Scott is, this guy who's writing all these things. And then I have found that he's one of the initiators of the 22nd Century Initiative. He describes himself as a veteran, although I would not say a veteran of the social and economic justice advocacy, organizer, political strategist, social movement analyst. So, but Scott, what is standing behind all these, organizer, analysts? What is your story? I say, from where your experience and your knowledge is coming?
Well, there are a couple of things. I grew up in a family in Hawaii, generations before me who had to fight against authoritarianism there. The plantation system in Hawaii, sugar and pineapple and other tropical fruits, was based on Jim Crow in the U.S. South. So it's a, explicitly white supremacist system. And immigrant laborers were brought to Hawaii from Asia to work in the field through the Masters and Servants Act, and among them my grandparents. And those immigrant laborers, eventually organized a union and went on strike because there was no other way for them to win political power. They were disenfranchised and not allowed to participate in direct politics. And by doing that, they were able to actually bring that system to its knees and change things in Hawaii so that Hawaii is much more democratic today than it was back in those days in the 30s and 40s. So that background made me always interested in understanding power dynamics of that sort. But in 1988 in Portland, Oregon, a young man named Mulugeta Surah, an Ethiopian immigrant who was a student at Portland State University in the state of Oregon in the US, was murdered by neo-Nazi skinheads. And it turned out that those neo-Nazi skinheads were part of a concerted effort upon part of the old white supremacist movement in the United States to colonize the Pacific Northwest, where I lived at the time, and make it into a white homeland. So they established an Aryan Nations compound there and funded and supported dozens of neo-Nazi groups. So I began researching that and organizing communities against it. And as it happened, we became under violent assault. And so we really needed to get ourselves organized in order to deal with that assault, particularly because the police in Portland were infiltrated by neo-Nazis. And one person in particular who ran the department that dealt with these groups was very sympathetic to them. So we had no police support in any of this. So when we were attacked, they never showed up in many cases. So we needed to figure out how to come up with a distributed organizing network and how to protect ourselves from these violent assaults and whatnot. And that just got me on the road of studying all of this and anticipating what might happen as I saw the Christian right rise to power in the United States and watched as the United States began backsliding into authoritarianism.
Thanks, Scott. And what I really appreciate kind of in your approach, and what attracted me particularly is that you combine somebody who is deeply involved in activism, in organizing, carried decades of the experience, and at the same time you are reflecting a lot what we are doing, and basically asking the hard question and starting with the point that we are not doing everything right. Let's say there are serious things what we need to rethink, reinvent, do differently. And this is something what I wanted on a part of your thinking, let's say, focus us today. In this article, what I mentioned, How Democracy Wins, you basically suggested that we need to invert the authoritarian playbook by Levitsky and Ziblatt in order to basically get the framework of the democracy winning model.
Uh-huh.
So before we go to analyze and understand the democracy winning model, can you just a little bit describe what the authoritarian playbook looks today?
Okay, well, in the United States, there's a sort of insulating effect that we experience, right? So you probably have more to say than I do on this subject, but I'll give this a stab. I'll take the stab at this, right? The contemporary playbook is both consistent across cases and continuously refined through learning between them. So today it runs roughly like this, right? Authoritarians no longer usually seize power by coups. Instead, they win elections, often very narrowly, and then use the legitimacy of that electoral victory to begin dismantling the institutions that constrain them. The sequence is usually capture the judiciary by appointing loyalists and attacking the legitimacy of judges who resist, capture the election machinery of the state by rewriting rules and installing partisan administrators, capture the security services by purging career professionals and promoting loyalists, and capture or neutralize the independent media by regulatory harassment, ownership consolidation, and targeted legal action against individual journalists. And then, of course, capture the universities by defunding, investigating, and ideologizing. So, alongside this institutional capture runs a parallel campaign of cultural war. Essentially, what the authoritarians had figured out after the Cold War ended was that they could turn the cultural fault lines that were papered over by the Cold War and turn them into political battle lines. And so, enemy groups are named and made visible: immigrants, sexual and gender minorities, religious minorities, intellectuals, whoever the local rhetoric most easily demonizes. So here in the US, intellectuals, in an example that most people don't think of, were first trivialized as effete, privileged snobs and then scapegoated for on the left, the ineffectiveness of the social justice sector, and then on the right for making government and the culture remote to ordinary people. So, that kind of campaign is not decorative. It needs to be understood as operational. It generates the permission structure for the institutional campaign, and it identifies the populations against whom the consolidating regime will demonstrate its power. So in this, two features distinguish the current playbook from earlier authoritarianisms. The first is the speed of consolidation. That has increased dramatically. So what took Putin a decade to do in Russia took Orban about 4 years in Hungary, and it's being attempted in roughly like a year and a half by the Trump administration. And then second, the international dimension has become central. Nowadays, there's effectively a transnational authoritarian coordination network. So they share tactics, amplify each other's messaging, undermine each other's opposition, and provide mutual aid when one regime comes under pressure. So Russia, Hungary, the Gulf states, and now the United States operate as a loose but real alliance of illiberal consolidation projects. In all of this, so there's also just one more thing worth naming, if I may. The current playbook relies on what I call socially constructed denialism. That's the deliberate cultivation of confusion about basic facts so that people retreat into tribe-based epistemology because reality itself has become contested. And this is not a byproduct of the playbook, right? It's one of its central tools.
This is, really kind of excellent description of, what authoritarians do to us, or what they do, let's say, to the citizens of their country. Let's say. So, how the inverted authoritarian playbook looks like. Let's say how democracy can defend itself, how it can try to fight back. What are the main phases? What are the key tasks and challenges in each phase? And later on, we will go more in detail.
Mm-hmm. Well, political scientists basically describe this in three phases, right? One is preparation, the next is breakthrough, and the third is consolidation. So the preparation period here in the United States rolled out over decades, but most significantly over the years between the first Trump administration and the second one, when an institution called the Heritage Foundation intervened and came up with something they called Project 2025, which was a comprehensive guidebook for how to take over and consolidate power across all of our institutions. So, these different phases, and then of course, the second phase is breakthrough, which the most recent presidential election here was for us. And then finally, consolidation, which is the project that we're in now. And so, the Trump administration is quickly trying to consolidate its power across the judiciary, across media, across many different parts of society, and of course, suppressing civil society in order to be able to accomplish all of this. Now, in the United States, we have some advantages that people often don't have in many other parts of the world, one of which is our federal system. So here in the United States, there are 50 states, and those 50 states basically have a lot more room to defend themselves than they do in many other places around the world. So Trump has to consolidate power across those 50 states and literally like 1,000 or more local jurisdictions, municipal and county, in order to be able to actually fully gain control. So that's basically where we're at. But what we were talking about was what happens is when you reverse that, right?
Yeah. And then the reverse, you kind of claim that it's useful to think about the reverse
Mhm.
also as something which is happening in a phases as well.
Yeah.
So how you yeah, kind of trying to intellectually now to twist,
Uh-huh.
let's say, this process.
Well, for pro-democracy movements, the tasks of preparation are, I think, building trust-based organizing infrastructure at community scale. What I in my work call springs, like springs that bubble up water. And then engaging the pillars of support of the authoritarian regime to prepare for defection. Developing parallel institutions where the state has abandoned its functions, which is substantial here in the United States because of neoliberalism, and articulating a reconstruction vision that is larger than restoration, cultivating the political imagination and strategic clarity that mass mobilization will require when the opportunity comes. So, preparation is also the phase most movements skip because they confuse their ability to mobilize people with readiness. So, that's a lot of what we're trying to do here. Breakthrough is a moment when mass mobilization is combined with cascading elite defection to create the possibility of a transition. That's rarely a single event. And so that's also confusing to people, right? It's usually a window of days, weeks, or occasionally months during which the established order loses the confidence of the people and of key elites simultaneously. The core task of the breakthrough phase is to convert the simultaneous loss of confidence into a transfer of power without either squandering the moment through disorganization or seizing too much through triumphalism, right? In the first Trump administration, we saw that happen. He squandered the moment through disorganization and overreached without a real plan. And then, of course, consolidation is the phase that most movements fail, and they fail because of a lack of preparation. So in this phase, the authoritarian regime has fallen or retreated, and the pro-democracy mobilization has achieved its proximate goal. But then the hard work begins, building institutions that can hold distributing power widely enough that new concentrations of power can't emerge, and addressing the economic structures that produced the crisis in the first place, while reconstructing a shared political culture. Most movements mistake breakthrough for victory, right? Consolidation is where democracy either takes root or fails to.
Now, I will come back to all these, elements of each of these phases because I really find them, let's say, very, very important. But before going into that, just to broaden the picture, let's say, and not just look on the United States. Let's say people who following me are mainly in other parts of the Europe, let's say East Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus, Asia. So, you know, we can think about three situations or three contexts. Let's say one is when basically authoritarian capture has just happened, is starting, but many institutions still hold. There is a vivid memory in a
Mhm.
society about, let's say, what democracy is and what people are losing. So this is
Uh-huh.
kind of one situation. Another situation in which kind of the democratic authoritarian capture has already happened. but we
Hmm.
still have the meaningful competitive opportunity in the
Yeah.
next elections, like what is described as a competitive authoritarianism. And then we have a deeply entrenched authoritarian, very repressive regime, like in Belarus, in Russia. So do you think that your kind of democracy win model works better for some of these contexts, or you
Yeah.
think that it works in all three contexts, maybe slightly differently?
No, it definitely works different in different contexts. I think that that's really important to keep in mind. So, I mean, the phases in the strategic logic travel well. The specific tactics and timelines do not. And trying to apply them mechanically, like, one size fits all, is one of the ways I think movements get hurt. So for democracies, as you say, under attack by elected leaders, the Czech case or the US before the 2024 election, or Israel in the judicial reform fight, or Brazil before Lula return, the model applies most directly, right? Democratic institutions still exist and can be defended at that point. So the work is to hold the pillars of democratic support in place through exactly the kind of coordinated civil society mobilization the model describes, right? Electoral strategy remains meaningful. Pillar defection from the authoritarian project is achievable because society hasn't been so fully polarized, and the institutions of independent life are not yet captured. But for hybrid regimes where backsliding has occurred, but elections remain like Hungary, Poland before 2023, Turkey, Slovakia, Georgia, the model requires serious adaptation. The electoral competition exists, but is structurally skewed. The media environment is captured, the judiciary is captured, civil society operates under legal and financial pressure that can be really extreme. So in these contexts, the preparation phase needs to do more work than in a fully democratic context. The breakthrough window is both narrower and more dangerous. So the model's emphasis on parallel institutions, on engaging pillars that are under heavy pressure from the regime, and on having a reconstruction vision ready for when the window opens, these become essential rather than optional. So Poland's 2023 electoral transition is probably the most clear recent case of a hybrid regime being pushed back through exactly this kind of civil society infrastructure plus electoral coordination.
Uh, you know, when we are talking about these things, we always usually say we. Let's say, what we if we lose, what if we win? Who are we? Both kind of in the case of the United States, but also globally. Who are we?
Well, for the playbook, the audience that I'm writing to is civil society, which I mean in the classical sense of the organized, non-state, non-market spaces where people build collective capacity. So these are community organizations, faith communities, labor networks, cultural institutions, even neighborhood associations, cross-sector coalitions, independent media, and then the layer of formal NGOs that work with them. I don't primarily mean political parties, and I don't mean the state, right? The work of the playbook is trying to equip is the work that civil society does, and the we is the people doing that work. But, in the US, though, there are some distinctions that are important. The American civil society I write for is unusually professionalized, unusually funder dependent, and usually shaped by the service provision model of nonprofit work. So it tends to have weaker roots in communities in civil society and many other places around the world. And it tends to have a more programmatic, rather, and less political operating culture. The combination of extreme individualism here and the neoliberal devolution of care for society to tax-exempt nonprofits creates a situation where the missions of groups aiming for deep social change here sometimes lean in the direction of being more advertisements for more donor investment than a set of goals that can be attained through the types of activities groups engage in. So what they're actually doing and their missions aren't always in alignment. So, when I write about confusing mobilization with preparation or about the dominance of process over judgment, I'm describing something that is particularly acute in this context in the US. Civil society in Poland, Hungary, the former Yugoslavia, or post-Soviet space often have a different relationship to political work. It's closer to it, more comfortable with it, less mediated through than what we here in the United States often refer to as a nonprofit industrial complex. So, but these contexts better than I do, so maybe I'm exaggerating, but that's my sense.
I think, look, let's say, Scott, I have started, I'm already 30 years in a civic activism, and if you want, I'm part of the professionalized NGO sector in my part of the world. I haven't started like that. I have started as a genuine kind of activist, having my regular job and that kind of doing civic activism parallel to that. But exactly because there is this kind of industrial scale donor funding system, in one moment you just kind of become, if you want, kind of comfortable with kind of becoming the professionalized NGOs. And I'm not the only one, let's say. And that brings me, let's say, to things what I'm doing now, trying to force myself and others to think that we need to reinvent what we do, because this model doesn't work anymore, even in our context. Because we also, I sometimes say, we are claiming that we are civil society, but we are disconnected from our own societies, and we are just part of the elite games and counter elite games, let's say. So I think what you are describing for United States goes very well for us, let's say. And then in our case, we are, even though this funding is coming from abroad, and Putin and others found a way how to basically stigmatize us by saying that we are foreign agents. So these things goes for us as well. Let's say. So look, let's say, let's now let me just kind of pick up one more concrete example, let's say, because I really always like to take our models and apply it for the concrete things happening now. The youth movements, let's say, in the last couple of years, we really have impressive youth movements, sometimes described as a Gen Z movement, and they have a pretty mixed results, let's say. In a Bangladesh and Nepal, let's say, they have succeeded to topple down the corrupt and authoritarian government and created opportunity for some meaningful opening. In Serbia, months of the impressive student-led demonstrations basically have maybe shaken the society, shaken the regime, but Vučić is still in a power. So what do you think these kind of recent youth movements, what they are doing right, and what they are doing insufficiently or doing wrong based on your thinking?
Well, I mean, I think what they're doing right is stepping up. They're very good at mobilizing. And I think that it's very promising seeing these uprisings, because I think they're an indication of something bubbling up across cultures that might lead in the direction of a kind of global, democratic renewal eventually. But, there are three things I think to think about, right? The first is that mass mobilization without adequate preparation can produce regime change in fragile authoritarian states where the ruling coalition is already brittle, but it rarely produces democratic consolidation. So Bangladesh and Nepal, which you referred to, remove governments. What comes next is an open question. And the historical record on uprisings that were not backed by durable civil society infrastructure is not encouraging, right? So if you think back to 2011, Egypt is a really good reference case. The regime fell, but the infrastructure to replace it didn't exist. What filled the vacuum was the one organized force that had been preparing for decades, which was not the democratic movement. So then the second, the Serbian case that you mentioned, shows what happens when the regime is not brittle and the mobilization isn't matched by pillar defection. So, the coalition held because the institutional capture is deeper than it was in Bangladesh, because the security services remain loyal, because economic elites have not calculated that their interests are better served by transition, and basically because the international context is ambiguous. The students have done really great work, but it's not sufficient in the absence of other moves, right? And then the third, and this is the harder thing, I think, to kind of wrap our minds around, mobilization is psychologically and politically easier than preparation. Right? Mobilization feels like doing something. It produces visible results in the short term, and it attracts media attention and international solidarity, so it feeds us. Preparation doesn't do this so much, right? So the Gen Z wave globally is producing genuine power, but is also producing a generation of young organizers who may be learning that mobilization is the work, when in fact mobilization is a tip of a much larger iceberg. So if the movements don't build the infrastructure that allows them to convert breakthrough into consolidation, or to survive the regime's counter response, right, when breakthrough doesn't come, the current moment will not likely produce durable change.
I have been many times in a situation working with democracy activists in a different countries, and there is always this dilemma: should we unify? When we try to unify, we just disagree on pretty much everything. Then we unify, and then we break. And you are suggesting, let's say, something what you, let's say, call the spring to river model. The different groups staying distinct but acting together. Let's say, can you just elaborate a little bit what this spring to river model means, and if you have any kind of real life examples which can help people, catch it better?
Okay, well, first, unified structures have like, coalitions, like what people in the United States call a big tent. They tend to try to push people in this sort of ideological neutral space, kind of ecru colored politics, right? They have two failure modes that the springs to river architecture I will describe avoids. First, they're brittle under repression. When the central structure is targeted, the whole network degrades or fails. And second, they're bad at holding coalitions of real difference together because the pressure to unify people either, produces the suppression of legitimate internal agreement or the fracturing of the coalition over those disagreements. So Springs to River holds the productive tension. So in that model, distinct communities keep their own identities, analyses, leadership structures, and relationships of trust. They don't just try to amalgamate these ideologies, go into ideological neutral. They coordinate when the coordination served a shared goal, right? So when there are trigger moments, opportunities to act, they come together, but they operate independently the rest of the time. So the river is a coordinated action at scale, and the springs are the community-rooted formations that feed it. Like the 2023 Polish election is a good example. The opposition to law and justice authoritarianism didn't unify into a single bloc. It held distinct parties, civil society networks, women's organizing around reproductive rights, rural farmer organizing, urban progressive networks, and Catholic Church adjacent democratic formations. They worked in parallel, coordinating around shared goals without collapsing into a single structure. So the breadth of the coalition was what produced the electoral result, that kind of ideological diversity. A unified structure could not have held all of those groups together, I don't believe. So Solidarity in Poland in the 80s is another good example, though the language of organizing, so to speak, is different in that example. Solidarity was not one organization, it was a federation of workplace, regional, and cultural formations that coordinated around a shared strategic orientation while maintaining distinct identities. That structure is part of why I believe it survived martial law. The regime could not decapitate it because it didn't just have a single head to cut off, right? And then the other one that I know better is the US Civil Rights Movement. So the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, Black Church Networks, even the labor movement, the National Council of Negro Women, and local community organizations were all coordinated through shared strategic moments, the campaigns in Birmingham, Selma, and the March on Washington, while maintaining distinct organizational identities and even theories of change and, of course, methods. That structure is what allowed the movement to survive the assassination of King, because the movement was not King and had never been reducible to any single organization.
That resonates for me a lot, let's say, and I agree. I have followed closely the Polish elections. We also had something similar, let's say, in the Czech Republic, let's say in the 2021 elections, with basically there has been a strong kind of social movement. There has been two coalitions of the different parties, and also very, very similar examples. And I think, let's say, these are the lessons really very, very useful for the others. So in this preparation, so one thing what we have discussed already is this building capacity to coordinate, remaining different, but building capacity to coordinate, which takes time. It means, let's say, building the trust relations, building the infrastructure of the coordination. Then another thing what you are highlighting is importance of engaging the pillars of the support of an authoritarian regime. So you are under the either hybrid authoritarian regime, authoritarian regimes. So what are the concrete examples how to engage the businesses, the religious institutions, military, police, professionals, and why that is so important?
Well, a concrete example in the United States is that there is a whole generation of veterans and retired military officers who are privately really appalled by the politicization of the armed forces under the current administration here, the Trump administration. Confronting them publicly, demanding that they denounce the administration, puts them in an impossible position and produces either silence or defensive loyalty. But engaging those pillars over time through the institutions they respect, through peers they trust, through quiet conversations about what military professionalism actually means, can produce a very different kind of result, right? When the breakthrough moment comes for us, those relationships are what make possible the kind of institutional refusal that actually moves the needle. So basically, drive defections from the military and neutralize other factions of the military so that we're able to actually continue moving and eventually cause the regime to topple. But another example from a different tradition is Otpor in Serbia in the late 90s, which worked extensively and importantly and quietly, which is also important, with Orthodox church networks, small business associations, and pensioner organizations. There were groups that were not ideological allies of the student movement and had no prior reason to oppose Milosevic. The work was relational. It did not demand that these groups become activists. It asked them to consider what their own institutional values implied about the Milosevic regime. By 2000, these groups had moved from acquiescence to opposition, not through confrontation, but through their own internal reasoning, which poor networks had helped to facilitate. So the pillar engagement question most movements get wrong is the question of pace. They want defection right now, right this minute, and they want it loudly because, of course, they're scared, right? But pillars defect quietly and often late when the balance has already shifted. The work is to make the shift possible, not to demand it before the pillar's internal conditions support it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we know it, we know it very well. Let's say from
Yes,
our
I'm sure.
Central East European experience. Let's say how critically, let's say these people in a shadow zone have been, let's say, in a critical moment. And I fully agree with you. Let's say how important it is. Let's say that you go confrontal on the worst of the worst, let's say, but then you quietly work with the others within the system, and I usually call them latecomers, but the latecomers which we will need. What about building parallelist infrastructure? So again, we are in authoritarian capture situation, and you are saying one of the things what during the preparation we need to do is building parallel infrastructure. What does it mean? What you have in mind with that?
Sure. The story I told you at the beginning about my grandparents and the work they did to topple what was then known as the Big five corporations that controlled the Hawaiian economy, over 100,000 workers under their thumb who were basically disenfranchised. That work, of building a union and then toppling that infrastructure, some of that infrastructure in order to be able to create a space for democratization there, required building parallel institutions because the control of the workers through the company store, through all of the different mechanisms controlling the food supply and whatnot, was in part, in fact, central to how they repressed those workers. So they built, hunting and fishing clubs, alternative banking systems, transportation systems, backyard gardening collectives, you name it, they did it. And also cultural work, right? Dance clubs and, cultural celebrations and whatnot to help the workers to feel like the movement was a community they wanted to belong to. So, these cases go way back in time. But more recently, in the 80s, the Polish underground publishing, the Samizdat networks, the Underground Solidarity Press, the alternative educational seminars, the Flying University, this was not protest infrastructure. It was a parallel civil society that kept democratic political culture alive through a decade of repression and was ready to operate openly the moment the political conditions shifted in around 1989, 90.
And
Yeah.
I'm also kind of with the people with whom I work. I'm also very often talking with them about this kind of parallel infrastructure building and why it is important. And I am usually using examples of the Czech dissident movement, which really developed also intellectually the concept of the parallel polis as
Mhm.
it was called, and really kind of has all the basic ideas of what is parallel infrastructure. And then another very good example is the Kosovo Albanians, let's say during the basically de facto Serbian apartheid regime. Then their nonviolent movement for 10 years basically created the whole parallel system of the education, of the health, of the self-governing. So these are also very, very useful examples.
Mhm.
Look, let's say kind of the one thing what strikes me when I was reading your article is that you are saying that that things what we overlook is developing a democratic reconstruction vision, that don't we should not think about just going back to the democracy we had before the authoritarian capture, but we need, as you said, to aim for the democracy which was promised to us but never fully delivered. And I
Mhm.
fully understand, let's say, what you have in mind, let's say, when you're thinking about United States now, or even in some extent, as you're thinking about us in Europe. But when I'm, in a Belarus, in a Russia, Georgia, Myanmar, let's say, where really harsh, tough authoritarian regime, and you are struggling against that, then the kind of all classical democracy looks good enough. This minimal
Yeah.
democracy, hey, give us just that, let's say. So do
Mhm.
you think also in this kind of very, very tough environment that we need also more vision of the democracy, and why?
Well, I mean, first, I just want to acknowledge that people in Belarus and Russia and Myanmar, and other comparable contexts have every right to articulate their democratic aspirations at whatever scale serves their movement, right? Someone organizing under active torture state conditions has no obligation to theorize reconstruction at the level that an American civil society leader operating under vastly less constraint can. So if the minimum democracy being sought is ending arbitrary detention, or allowing contested elections or whatever, that's something that's legitimate under those circumstances. But you know, the democracies that consolidated most durably after breakthrough, say in the post 1989 and post 2014 experience, these were ones that whose movements had articulated a vision larger than procedural restoration, right? Poland's solidarity vision included workplace democracy and social solidarity, not just free elections. The South African tradition, or transition rather, vision included social and economic transformation and not just the end of apartheid. Where the post-breakthrough vision collapsed to restore procedural democracy, the consolidation phase was vulnerable to economic concentration, oligarchic capture, and the generation of grievances that authoritarian actors later exploited. So Russia in the 1990s, I think is the paradigmatic failure case. So my answer is minimum democracy is a legitimate proximate goal, but movements that do not also cultivate a larger Reconstruction imagination while they organize tend to win the breakthrough and lose the consolidation. So we need to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. The imagine of what could be and can be held in the movement's strategic imagination doesn't need to be articulated in the public demand, right? And that distinction really matters. But having that vision makes a very, very big difference.
Uh, you are talking about movements that miss the opportunities because they have not prepared,
Hmm.
and movements that have used the opportunity because they have been prepared.
Hmm.
Can you illustrate, give us, just few examples of, those who missed and those who didn't, and why?
Well, there are lots of different examples of things that have happened, right? So mass mobilization alone produces either regime concession or regime repression, depending on the regime's confidence. Elite defection alone produces either a palace coup or a factional stalemate. And breakthrough happens at the specific conjunction of the two things coming together, right? Because that's the moment when the regime loses the ability to reliably deploy either coercive force or institutional legitimacy. So Serbia, for example, 2000, the mass mobilization had been building for years. And what converted it to breakthrough was three things, right? The first was the moment when the police and military calculated that firing on demonstrators would split their institutions. The second, when business elites concluded that Milosevic was a bigger threat to their interests than the opposition. And the third, when the Orthodox Church and other traditionalist pillars signaled that they wouldn't back a violent defense of the regime. So mass mobilization plus cascading elite defection within the same window caused the regime to fall in a matter of days. And then in Tunisia in 2011, the mass mobilization triggered by, the self-immolation became a breakthrough moment when the military refused to fire on protesters and when key members of the ruling party calculated that Ben Ali was a liability. So it's mass plus elite. And then South Africa, of course, in the 90s, there the mobilization had been building for a generation. And what converted it to breakthrough was first the business elite's calculation that continued apartheid was economically unsustainable. And the second was the Afrikaner political elites' internal conclusion that negotiation was preferable to civil war. So de Klerk's decision to release Mandela and legalize the ANC was an elite move. And that was made possible by the sustained mass pressure that preceded it. So the cases where movements fail to achieve breakthrough often show one of the two elements present and the other missing. So Belarus in 2020, we saw extraordinary mass mobilization, but security services held and business elites did not defect. Iran's Green Movement in 2009, mass mobilization again, but the Revolutionary Guards and the clerical elite held. Hong Kong, same thing, right? In the around 2019 to 20, sustained mass mobilization was very impressive, but Beijing's backing meant elite defection in Hong Kong was insufficient against the actual power structure opposing it. So, situationally, things can be quite different.
Yeah. And I'm, with people with whom I work, I'm also, because of all these things, I'm also very, very often, let's say, saying to them, let's not just kind of study the mobilization tactics, but let's also, let's say, kind of do the proper power analysis. And because I have seen very, very often kind of the people, let's say, jump into the mobilization without doing the preparatory power analysis work. And what you then mentioned, let's say, basically understand what are the pillars and in a certain way work on this pillar and wait for the right moment, let's say, when the regime is really kind of shaken by economic crisis or some, let's say, overreach or whatever.
Yeah.
Scott, you are talking about vulnerability and fragility of the transition. Right? So can you just a little bit elaborate for the people who didn't read your article and say what you mean by the vulnerability and fragility of the transition? Why?
Well, basically it's rooted in a lack of preparedness, right? A lack of spending the time to make sure that, before the breakthrough moment, that you're prepared to govern, that you have a plan. So, because movements miss these breakthrough moments or fail once they happen because they're not prepared. So Egypt in 2011 is basically the canonical case, right? The Tahrir Square mobilization produced a democratic breakthrough. But here we saw the combined effect of a mass mobilization plus Mubarak's loss of elite and military confidence. The movement had no prepared political infrastructure to hold the window that opened, though. So the vacuum was filled by the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been preparing for decades, and then by the military, which had no intention of ceding power to anyone. So the lesson here is not that the Brotherhood was wrong to be prepared. It is that the democratic movement was, well, I don't know if I call it wrong, but was basically wrong to, I guess, to have assumed that breakthrough would produce consolidation without infrastructure. And the same is true of Iran in 1979. It's a different version. The revolutionary coalition that overthrew the Shah included secular Democrats, communists, and the bizarre merchant class, as well as Islamic networks around Khomeini. Only the Islamic networks had prepared for the consolidation phase. So within 18 months, they had consolidated power, and the other components of the coalition had been marginalized, jailed, killed. The preparation gap produced the post-revolutionary regime. And then, of course, the Arab uprisings in general around 2010, 11. Tunisia is a partial exception, and it's an exception specifically because Tunisian civil society had built durable preparation infrastructure. The Labor Federation, the Lawyer Syndicate, the human rights organizations, and democratic political parties, they were able to hold the transition through multiple crises. The other cases that reached breakthrough, like Libya, Yemen, and to a different degree, Syria and Bahrain, did not have that infrastructure, and the outcomes there reflect that difference. So, Poland in 89, Czechoslovakia in 89 succeeded because the preparation infrastructure had been built over decades. Moment the Soviet backing collapsed, civil society had the institutional capacity to enter the breakthrough window with a program and a negotiating team and a vision. And within months, they had a transition plan. So the difference in these cases is not heroism, the lack thereof, right? It's preparation. Movements that had done the work entered the breakthrough window with the capacity to hold it, and movements that had not lost it. And this is not about being smart or not smart, brave, not brave, or whatever, but structural realities in these places either allow or prevent people from being able to do that kind of preparation.
Uh,
But
one more topic which kind of has been very important for us in our own context. There is the question of the reconciliation dilemma, we can call it, or inclusion dilemma. So let's imagine a situation that has been authoritarian kind of long period. We have a democratic breakthrough. We are now trying to consolidate democracy, but we have a lot of kind of the institutions, people, actors, groups, let's say, which have been supported authoritarian regime for a long time, kept
Mhm.
him in a power. So, if I understood well, you are suggesting, let's say, that basically it is necessary to include also the groups which previously supported authoritarian system in this consolidation period. But on the other side, let's say, many of them will become the spoilers. They will be the
Yeah.
permanent source of the authoritarian tendency. So how to balance these two things?
Well, there's this inclusion principle that a big democratic tent is more durable than a narrow one, right? But that's about inclusion of populations who supported authoritarianism, not inclusion of institutions that enforced it. Um, these are really different problems with different answers, right? Populations who voted for authoritarian parties, who acquiesced to authoritarian rule, maybe benefited materially from the old regime in ways short of direct enforcement. These groups need to be included in the democratic reconstruction because excluding them produces the grievance politics that authoritarianism feeds on. So, post-war Germany and Japan are the cases that demonstrate what inclusion can do. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process is the more complicated case that demonstrates both the value and the limits. But institutions of the old regime, the secret police, intelligence services, et cetera, that propaganda apparatus, economic concentrations that funded authoritarianism, these can't simply be included because their institutional function under the old regime was specifically to enforce authoritarianism. And so their personnel are disproportionately the people who enforced it, right? Attempting to include them as equal partners in the democratic reconstruction produces exactly the spoiler dynamics that you're describing. So the post-Soviet record is unambiguous about this. Countries that substantially dismantled or deeply reformed the security services, the Baltic states, Slovakia's, excuse me, lustration process, consolidated democracy more durably. Countries that left the old security apparatus substantially intact, Russia under Yeltsin, say, found those institutions becoming power centers that undermined democratic consolidation and, in several cases, produced authoritarian restoration. So the limit of exclusion is institutional, not populational.
Yeah.
Individuals who staffed old regime institutions can, in many cases, be reintegrated into society. The institutions themselves in their old regime form cannot be. The need to be dismantled, radically reformed, or replaced is there. The Polish case, the Czechoslovak case, the East German integration into the Federal Republic all involve substantial dismantling and rebuilding of key old regime institutions. The democracies that skip this step, they pay for it later, right?
One thing what kind of really I don't have a response to it, so maybe I challenge you, maybe you help me. I say this is because the change the 90s. Change in the 90s is different because at least in our part of the world you didn't have the accumulated wealth.
Yeah.
Let's say the wealth of state control, and then this process of the privatizing state control is where the oligarchization happened. But in a current authoritarian, let's say, settings, basically oligarchs are already there. They
Mhm.
became the oligarchs under the authoritarian system. They accumulated huge wealth. You remove the political authoritarianism, but at least concentrated wealth is still
Mhm.
kind of in the hands of the guys who basically, you know, accumulated it in a previous regime. Let's say, but it's a
Mhm.
private property, very often connected with the international investment. Let's say, so how to deal with that? Let's say, how to dismantle this economic power after the breakthrough.
Well, I mean, it's a really difficult question, but I think it's really important to, understand the situation that we're in, right? I mean, basically what neoliberalism did, the deregulation of economies like the United States, for example, is it caused a group of oligarchs to be able to consolidate huge amounts of wealth and power, right? And then insulate that wealth and power, corporations, financial markets, et cetera, from democratic decision making. Now, what they're doing is cooperating internationally in order to make sure that that installation is permanent by taking down democracy altogether. So it's not just attempts to regulate, but to take away the mechanisms by which regulation is possible in the first place. And so we need to be aware of this and look in the direction of democratizing economies. The Philippines is a good example of this. When Corazon Aquino was able to finally emerge victorious and Ferdinand Marcos was ousted, what Aquino failed to do that has, I think, contributed substantially to the situation the Philippines is in now, again under authoritarian rule, is that it failed to engage in serious land reform. And so the basis of oligarchic wealth in the Philippines was never challenged substantially, partly, I think, because the Aquino family was, or at least Corazon Aquino's family was a beneficiary of that. And so, these are the things to look at, right? What are the mechanisms by which wealth is being accumulated? You can't just leave those alone. If you don't break them up, they will reconsolidate. They will, basically from below undermine the new democratic regime and slowly cause it to collapse. So that's something that I think is very, very important. And it's part of the reason why the participation of labor in these movements is really critical, right? We need labor unions, not just because they give us the infrastructure, relationship, and particularly with key constituencies that are necessary in order to topple these dictatorships, but because they need to be positioned to be able to help us understand how to democratize the economy going forward and build labor power.
Do we still have the labor in a gig economy, in a platform capitalism? Let's say, where
Uh-huh.
the do we have, or we have something new as a labor, and it is really posing another challenge to us?
Well, I mean, we do need to think about labor in a different way. I mean, platform capitalism is basically the means by which authoritarians are consolidating power and taking over, right? And so, but I think that it's really important to continue to think of even traditional labor as a key asset here. Many people around the world have looked at this question, and political scientists in particular, and among them, there are those who suggest that if the administrative state acts to try to prevent an authoritarian takeover, the odds of winning are less than 9%. If civil society gets engaged and mass civil resistance movement comes together, the odds go to about 50-50. But if labor joins that effort and substantially invests, the odds can go much higher, up to over 80%. So it's really necessary for us to think about that and think about ways to be able to organize even platform capitalists, like economy workers, in order to be able to to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Because obviously, their institutions, their corporations, their whatever can't function without us, right? In the United States, when Donald Trump was elected president, there was a moment during his inauguration when oligarchs from across a broad spectrum, particularly tech economy people or tech sector people, kind of stood on the stage with him and stared down Congress and the public, and people were very intimidated. But I think that they may be overreaching because the reality is, of course, their platforms can't function without our cooperation. And so if we withdraw that cooperation, the possibility exists that we can cause them to collapse.
And if I follow the same kind of line of the thinking where you said we need kind of labor and organized labor on the side of the democratic movement or the part of the democratic movement. What about religion and church? Let's say religion and church are now really very skillfully used by authoritarians across the
Mhm.
globe. Let's
Yeah.
say to fuel the cultural wars, and they use them as one of the very important pillars. Let's say. So what
Mhm.
that mean? That mean that we also need basically part of the church, part of the religion, let's say, on our side, and systematically work on that, because otherwise, let's say, basically, we have a too powerful tool in the hands of the authoritarians.
Well, I mean, working with faith communities is really critical to the effective resistance. Faith is a kind of mega pillar, right? Because they can reach across different pillars. So people in the military, for example, belong to faith communities. Business leaders belong to faith communities and often take their cues from those communities first, right? So if you're a Catholic, if the Catholic Church says, no, this can't be, that creates a kind of personal crisis for you within your community, within your faith, and within your family. And so it's really, really important that we, consider faith as a really important part of the work that we're doing. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that, faith traditions around the world, all the great axial religions are in a major crisis right now. Something along the lines of the Protestant Reformation is affecting, the Islamic world, even Buddhists, certainly Protestants, Christians in general. This is something that we need to keep in mind. There's a crisis of faith underway, and that largely, I think, is the result of globalization and the emergence of all these new technologies that are challenging the authority of the church in ways that are causing people to lose faith in them and to feel insecure because of the weaknesses that they're witnessing, right? So, when your religious tradition is challenged, people will go to other alternatives, often to conspiracy theories or to new radical traditions within faith communities, like the Christian nationalist movement in the United States, which is now taking a very violent turn.
Mm. One thing what you highlighted, in a democracy consolidation phase is
Mhm.
importance of the decentralizing power. You see, authoritarians consolidate by consolidated power in the hands of one man or in the hands of the narrow circle. The democracy consolidation should be about distributing power, and I fully agree. But when I'm thinking again about our context, let's say when you have a democratic breakthrough, for example, Armenia after the Velvet Revolution, or Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, and then later on Euromaidan, you have the remnants of the previous regime still there. You need to handle
Mhm.
them, and then you have the hostile, powerful neighbor state, which
Mhm.
basically is systematically working on undermining your democratic transition. Let's say. So how to decentralize power in such conditions? How to defend yourself. Let's say if you are small Moldova and you have an overwhelming Russian hybrid regimes. Let's say then we say, oh no, we need to have a protective state. We need to have a strong state. We need to
Uh-huh.
keep the Russia. We need to stop the free media kind of Russian freedom for Russian media in our media space. Let's say. So do you have some thinking about that? How to handle this kind of the threat from the outside?
Well, I mean, first, Russian media thing. I mean, selective restrictions on foreign state-operated propaganda networks are not the same as restrictions on democratic discourse. I think that's really important to keep in mind. Conflating them is a huge analytical error that we should avoid. So, Russian state media operating in Moldova, for example, is not a civil society actor. It's an arm of a hostile state conducting hybrid warfare. right? Restricting it is a defensive measure analogous to expelling foreign intelligence officers, not a limitation of Moldovan civic freedom. The line I would hold is this: restrictions on specifically state-operated or foreign state-financed information operations are defensible when tied to clear criteria, subject to judicial review, and implemented through processes that cannot be applied to domestic political speech. Restrictions on domestic media, on dissenting speech, or on civil society organizations, even those that echo hostile foreign narratives, are much harder to justify and tend to become tools for the consolidation of power by whoever is holding the restrictions, right? So that's
Mm.
important to keep in mind, no matter which side. The positive agenda matters more than the restrictive one. So the durable defense against Russian information warfare is not censorship, but the cultivation of a media environment, a civic culture, and a political discourse that can outcompete the hostile narratives on their merits. That means investment in public broadcasting, support for independent journalism, civic education, and critical thinking. Basically building civil society capacity to counter disinformation through engagement rather than prohibition.
Mm.
Finland is the case I would point to. Its, resilience to Russian information warfare has come primarily through its civic and educational infrastructure, not primarily through its restrictions. So, that's one thing. But, movements fail after winning because they make really common mistakes, is what I've found.
Mm.
One is that they demobilize, right? The coalition that produced the breakthrough stops organizing the moment power changes hands because they treat victory as the end point. The institutional infrastructure that would have held the transition erodes before it can be built into governance. And then the second thing is premature reconciliation. So the movement
Mm.
that declares the struggle over and embraces the former regime's personnel and institutions as partners in the new order discovers within a few years that those personnel and institutions have been quietly restoring conditions of the old regime. So post-Soviet Russia is the worst case. There are many post-transition states that have milder versions, and I think Hungary may face that same challenge now, after 16 years of consolidation. And then the third, which we already discussed some, is economic blindness. So the movement wins the political transition, but leaves the economic structure intact, providing oligarchic consolidation that undermines the political democracy, often within a decade. So this is the story of post-1989 transitions and of most Latin American transitions from the 1980s. And then, of course, there's coalition fracture. So internal differences that were suppressed during the fight, papered over by the pressure, become disruptive under transition conditions when people are vying for power. And the movement spends its political capital fighting its own former allies rather than building institutions. And I think post-1991 Russia, post-revolutionary Iran in a different way, and Tunisia after 2011, these are all good examples.
And Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, it also
Yes.
goes very well in that group.
Yes, and of course, there's institutional capture by the movement itself, right? So the movement's leaders enter government and become a new elite, and with the same incentives towards self-preservation and power consolidation the old elite had, and often justify this by what the old elite did, right? That one needs to be prevented. The revolutionary period becomes the founding mythology of a new regime that is less democratic than the movement's rhetoric claim. And this historical pattern is, one that starts with the French Revolution and goes onward. And then finally, I would say there's one more thing to consider, which is the failure of the Reconstruction imagination. And we hit on this earlier. The movement did not develop a positive program for what comes after the old regime and then fails, and discovered that anti-authoritarian is not a sufficient organizing principle for governance, right? That's just an opposition. The vacuum is filled by whichever faction has the most coherent positive program, and that can often not be the democratic one, especially because authoritarians offer simple solutions. And in a transition like that, the chaos can be scary, right? So all of those failure modes are products of preparation gaps. I just say over and over again, prepare, 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 because the movement that has done the most preparation has the most durable infrastructure, has cultivated the pillars, has developed the reconstruction imagination, has the economic analysis, that enters consolidation with the tools that phase requires.
Scott, the last question
Mhm.
is, if somebody is a movement that is still small and fragmented,
Mhm.
what will be the first 2, 3 steps they need to prioritize according to your opinion?
Okay, well, we talked a little bit about the rivers and streams to rivers framework that my organization has developed and is popularizing around the United States. The idea is to, understand that ideology is necessary to movement building, and that the distinctiveness of people's ideology is really important. So, what those different diverse ideological groups should do is form spring circles, not a chapter of an organization or, that sort of thing, but a circle of people, maybe 10, 20, 30, who are doing real work together over real stakes and have been doing that work long enough that trust is genuine. It's not a coalition, not an organization, but a spring is what we're calling it. Um, if you cannot name the people who would take risk for you and for each other, you have not built it yet, basically. And everything else you do will rest on that gap. But then, second, identify one pillar of support of the authoritarian project in your context that your spring is structurally positioned to engage a specific religious community, a specific professional association, business sector, veterans network, whatever it happens to be, and begin the long and patient work of engagement without demanding immediate political return. Expect, in fact, to be doing this work for years. And then the next thing is articulate a reconstruction vision that is specific to your context and larger than restoration. Not a platform, but a vision of the society you want to build. So write it, debate it within the spring. Let it guide the work. The vision is what tells you what the spring and pillar work are for. And so these three things, one spring, one pillar, one vision, are the preparation phase in its most compressed form. A small fragmented movement that does these things seriously over 3 to 5 years, say, is substantially different as a political actor than one that runs campaigns for the same period. The infrastructure compounds. The mobilization actually does not, right? And so all of
Mm.
those springs need to be connected by some kind of secure communication network, some kind of distributed organizing strategy, so that when breakthrough moments happen, you can trigger those strings to feed a mighty river of change that makes authoritarianism ungovernable. So that's the idea, right? So again, this is all about preparation. It's all about preparation. We need to organize around mobilization, campaigns, communication work, with a long-term horizon, and recognize that relational infrastructure building work that produces movements capable of holding breakthrough when it comes is what we need. Um, and keep in mind, in all of this, of course, right? You know this at least as well, probably better than I do. The funding does not reward it. The professional pathways do not reward it. The metrics do not measure it. And the political culture does not value it for the most part. So it does not happen. The sector spends its resources on activities that look like work, but do not produce the capacity the movement will require. So you need to actually go upstream against that in order to be able to do the work that's necessary. And that makes it tough. That makes it hard, slow work. It's kind of a big slog.
Scott, thanks a lot. I really kind of enjoyed a lot us discussing. I'm really kind of happy that we get to know each other, although through the Zoom so far. I hope that our discussion will bring you, let's say, some readers from my circle,
Mhm.
because your thinking and writing is really kind of useful for us. Keep on doing what you are doing, and hopefully we will meet each other somewhere in the real life.
Well, I hope we'll meet each other too. And it's been a real pleasure getting to know you. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, and have a nice day. Bye bye.
Okay. You too.